When James moved to a small town, his life changed. He had always dreamed of a quiet life in a private house, away from the hustle and bustle of the metropolis, and now, finally, he had found the perfect place for himself. The house stood in a picturesque area, surrounded by green hills and forests. James quickly settled in, got to know his neighbors, and among them was a guy named Adam. Adam lived in the house across the street, and seemed to be the only neighbor who was always happy to welcome a new resident. They had met as soon as James had moved in. Adam had been friendly and welcoming. He had suggested that James stop by for a visit to get to know each other better. At first James was a little wary. There is always something strange about a new place. However, Adam seemed pleasant and friendly, and they soon became good friends. One of the most memorable moments of their meetings was the treats that Adam always brought James. He offered red cookies, always fresh, with an unusual flavor. James liked them very much. The cookies were sweet and a little spicy, flavored with something unfamiliar, yet delightfully delicious. He often asked Adam how he managed to make such unusual cookies. Adam smiled and replied that it was an old family recipe that had been passed down through the generations. Every time James came to Adam's house, he would treat him to his cookies again. It became an integral part of their conversation, and each time James felt a special connection between him and Adam. But as time went on, James noticed that Adam was becoming more and more secretive. He began to invite him to visit less often, and even when James did, Adam was often absent. It was almost as if something had changed. After a couple days, James noticed that he couldn't see Adam at all. He tried calling him, sending him messages, but there was no response. It seemed strange. Usually Adam was quite active and always answered. James figured that maybe his roommate was away on business and just waited. However, time passed and he still couldn't figure out what was going on. One day, when James was deciding it was time to move to another town, he decided to stop by to say goodbye to Adam. He hadn't seen him in a while and didn't know what could have happened, but he still wanted to say a few words before he left. James walked up to Adam's house and knocked on the door. There was silence. He knocked again. It was quiet, but there was no answer. As he got closer, he noticed that the door was ajar, as if it hadn't been locked. Without thinking, James pushed the door handle lightly, and it opened easily. As he stepped inside, he immediately felt a strange tension in the air. It was business as usual, but there was an ominous silence in the house. James called out to Adam, but there was no answer. He made his way into the kitchen, then the hall, and finally his gaze stopped at the door leading to the basement. James felt his heart beat faster, but curiosity took over and he went downstairs. The basement was dark, with only a dim light coming through a small window, illuminating something amongst the old crates and things. James walked deeper and deeper until he came across a strange object lying in the corner. It was the same red cookie. James looked closer and noticed that the cookies were in several jars, neatly arranged on shelves. He bent down to get a closer look at them, but his gaze accidentally fell on a body. Adam lay on the floor, dead, his face pale and contorted with pain. In his hands lay a jar of blood, dark, thick blood. James felt his stomach roll as he realized that his roommate was no longer who he appeared to be. But that wasn't all. On the floor, next to the body, was another jar, from which James realized that Adam had used the blood to make cookies. He looked around in a daze. There were strange drawings on the walls of the basement that looked like ancient symbols and a few pictures. Some of them showed people James recognized. They were people who had disappeared in the neighborhood over the past few years. And all of these people, judging from the photos, were part of the very same cookie. At that moment, James realized the horrible truth. All this time, Adam had been treating him to cookies that were made of people. He was a killer who lured his victims, turned them into ingredients for his cookies, and kept working his family recipe without stopping. Adam's body was cold, but next to him stood a jar of freshly drawn blood. James realized that he was the next victim, and probably next in line. His hands were shaking as he tried to get out of this scary place. He was in a hurry, not knowing how to get out or what to do with what he had just learned. Breathing heavily, James ran outside and never looked back again. A couple days later, his things were packed and he was off to another town. He would never forget Adam and those awful cookies that someone might even be eating now. Jessica has always considered herself a person who loves tranquility. After years of living with her parents, she finally found the right place to start her independent life. A studio apartment in an old apartment building on the outskirts of town seemed perfect. The apartment was inexpensive, and it was in a quiet neighborhood, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The only drawback was the age of the house itself. It had been built in the early 20th century, and its condition left much to be desired. Nevertheless, Jessica was willing to put up with a little inconvenience to get her own space. From the first days of living in the new apartment, everything went smoothly. The apartment was cozy, and Jessica enjoyed the quiet and solitude. The house, though old, was fairly quiet, and she rarely ran into neighbors. The only thing she didn't like were a few neglected rooms on the top floor that hadn't been renovated in a long time and remained closed. As time went on, Jessica began to feel like this place was becoming her home. However, a few weeks after she moved in, strange things started to happen. First of all, it was the sounds coming from the neighboring apartment. At first, Jessica didn't pay attention to the slight noises. Faint knocks and creaks, as if someone was moving something, or footsteps on the wooden floor. But after a week, these noises became regular. They sounded at night, most often at 2 or 3 a.m., and were always the same. Footsteps, then a sound as if someone was slowly pulling heavy furniture across the floor. Occasionally a thud would also reach her, as if something was falling or colliding with the floor. Jessica figured they were the usual sounds of an old house, which wouldn't be unusual for a building of that age. But soon, when she decided to step out into the hallway one such nighttime moment, she noticed something strange. There was no number on the door of the neighboring apartment across from hers. Usually all apartments were numbered, but this one was without a number, as if it didn't exist at all. Jessica didn't pay much attention to it, but she couldn't escape the feeling of unease. A few days later, as she was coming home late at night, she saw a man. He was standing right outside her door, and seemed to be waiting for her to come back in. Jessica froze in place. The man looked strange. He was dressed in old clothes, his hair was a bit tangled, and his eyes were vacant and strange. He looked to be about 40 years old, but his face was pale, with few wrinkles. He didn't smile or say a word. When Jessica came closer, the man just stood there, unmoving, staring at her. She felt a chill run down her spine. For a moment she thought his gaze was too penetrating, too strange. As if he could see through her instead of just looking at her. "I'm sorry, do you need something?" Jessica finally asked, trying to hide the growing concern in her voice. The man didn't answer. He continued to stare at her as if he couldn't hear her words. This went on for several long seconds, and Jessica felt her heart begin to beat faster. She swallowed nervously and took a step back. "I'm sorry, I'm in a hurry." She quickly opened the door and walked into the apartment without looking back. She couldn't sleep that night. Thoughts of meeting this strange man wouldn't leave her alone. She didn't even know what to feel, fear or curiosity. She tried to convince herself that it was just an accident, that the man was probably just lost, but the thought of his blank stare continued to torment her. The next day Jessica decided to talk to the building manager to find out who lived in the apartment next door. She went downstairs to the office, where she met an old man who had worked here for many years. Jessica asked her question politely, but the old man didn't answer right away. "A neighbor?" He scratched his chin, clearly not sure what she was talking about. "There's no neighbor in that apartment. No one lives there. But I heard noises, and I saw a man at the door." "A man?" The old man's face became pensive. "No one's lived in that apartment for years. Maybe you imagined it." Jessica couldn't believe what he said. How could she be mistaken? She could see the man clearly. He was right in front of her. Strange, silent, and mysterious. That evening, after work, she noticed the same scent again. It was light but unpleasant, like old wood and musty air, but that odor wouldn't go away. She decided to walk down the hallway again, and checked the door of the one apartment that remained unoccupied. She noticed that the door was slightly ajar. Dust immediately rose from her feet, and there were shoe marks on the floor. Jessica hesitated to go in, but her curiosity took over, and she pushed the door open. What she saw shocked her. The inside was dark and desolate. Old, dust-covered furniture, brittle wooden beams that looked like they were about to fall. There was an old bed in the corner, but worst of all, there was a picture of the very man who stood at her door hanging on the wall. The same blank stare, the same pale facial features. The room was cold, and Jessica felt her body goosebump. She closed the door abruptly and ran to her apartment without looking back. The next day, when she tried to find out more from the neighbors or the old man from the house management, she was told a strange story. A long time ago, there had been a man named Jonathan who had lived in the building and had suddenly disappeared, leaving behind only frightening rumors. It was said that he was possessed by some incomprehensible fear, and when he disappeared, no one knew what happened to him. His apartment remained empty, and even the door, according to the old watchman, was always locked. Jessica realized that her encounter with this man was no coincidence. But who was he? What did he want with her? After a few weeks, Jessica decided to move out. But even as she left the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her. This house, this strange man, seemed part of something bigger that she couldn't understand. Jack was returning home late in the evening after a long day at work. The road leading to his country house was surrounded by dense woods, and the only light that shone through the darkness came from the headlights of his car. There was silence, broken only by the steady hum of the engine and the creak of trees swaying in the faint night wind. Around the next corner Jack saw a human figure in the distance. A man was standing by the curb, waving his hand as if begging him to stop. Jack's heart sank for a moment, but he hesitated, slowed down, and drove closer. The headlights illuminated the stranger, and Jack saw his face, tired, dark-eyed, and strangely blank. Jack rolled down his window and asked, "Do you need help?" The man didn't answer. He just stared straight at Jack, silent and motionless, as if frozen in some tense expectation. That gaze, deep and silent, gave Jack an overwhelming sense of unease. An inner voice cried out to him to leave at once. Crazy, Jack thought, lifting the window and stepping on the gas, leaving the stranger in the dark. The next day, opening the news, Jack felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The headline on the screen read, "Body of unknown man found on road where murder occurred last night." The photo under the headline showed the face of the very man who had waved at him.